everyone, and welcome back to Scylla's Podcats, and today I have a first of, I'm not entirely sure how many to come actually, because I don't really want to be doing that like full-time or anything on this channel. But today I have a very first rant review for all of you because I cannot keep quiet about this. I just feel like I need to explain my reasoning behind it, and listen, to absolutely no one's surprise, at least for the ones who know that I have been reading this book or wanted to read this book anyway. Today we're talking about Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Right, it was bad, y'all. I gave it 1 star. I don't give books 1 star unless they're really bad for whatever reason. Alright, so before we get into what I personally didn't like about it and what I think the book also just objectively suffered from, a few disclaimers. Disclaimer number 1, most, if not all, opinions on books are going to be subjective, or at least influenced by subjective ideas, subjective thoughts, experiences, and whatnot that you've had with different books over time. So even if I say I hate Fourth Wing, you might not necessarily hate it, and that's okay. Alright? And it also doesn't necessarily mean that one person knows what makes a book a good book or a bad book. Bad books can also be a lot of fun. Sometimes good books can be not so much fun. So, you know, it really depends on what kind of reading experience you're looking for, and so on and so forth. Disclaimer number 2. I'm not going to say, and I don't want to say anything along the lines of like, I don't understand how this became so popular. Because on one hand, no one ever fully understands what makes a book popular or not popular. It just happens, especially in the age of things very suddenly going viral for no apparent reason whatsoever. And 2, I know why. I know what kind of audience this book has, and good for those people. I am not one of them. Fourth Wing very much, in my opinion, speaks to people who either don't read that much fantasy, haven't read a lot of fantasy in a long time, are sometimes intimidated by big books, because I mean this is 500 pages, but it is extremely readable. It took me not like... Let me try and do the math, maybe like 4 hours or something to read this. Probably less than that, and while I do read books very fast, I did read this faster than a lot of others because it's just incredibly readable, as in the writing style is very easy to understand. It also feels like a book that is not exactly great for fantasy beginners, because I don't feel like people should be introduced to the genre with Fourth Wing, but it's a book that is very readable for people who do not have that much experience with fantasy, as I said. It's going very easy on the supernatural elements, it's going very easy on explanations to the reader and everything. There we go. Also, it has smut. There is a big audience for that. I would also say, you know, Fourth Wing is romantasy, and I personally always like to draw a bit of a line between fantasy and romantasy, but like, you know, romantasy is an entire market, and there's a lot of people buying it, and there's a lot of people loving it, and Fourth Wing is just going into a lot of the tropes and character constellations and just character work in general that a lot of people like about romantasy. Great. I understand why a lot of people like Fourth Wing. I just hate it. And there's a lot of reasons why. So, without further ado, as I said, you know, if you like this book, that's great. Feel free to click off this video. Feel free to stay and, you know, give me some comments on, like, for example, why you loved it. If you would reconsider some of those points now, or if you're just like, you know, I had a good time and that's enough, because that is enough. I'm glad you had a good time. I didn't, in case it wasn't very obvious. But, you know, let's get into what happened with Fourth Wing, shall we? Right, so the thing that Fourth Wing does is it unfortunately combines a lot of things I don't necessarily enjoy within the fantasy genre. So first of all, As I've said before, I am not the biggest romantasy fan. I do like a very good romance every once in a while, especially in fantasy, usually more likely in fantasy than in contemporary, because I'm just really not the biggest romance, capital R, contemporary person. But I kind of have this lingering resentment about so many people just nilly-willy putting romantasy and fantasy into the exact same category, when in my opinion they're not, because they usually have a very different structure, which is fair, but more often than not, when you pick up a book and you expect it to just be fantasy with maybe some romance sprinkled in, and then you actually end up with a romance with fantasy elements, it can feel a bit like a betrayal, you know? And like, in this case it didn't, but still, again, as I said as a disclaimer, did I give this book a fair chance? Probably not. I read it at the same time as I finished up my read of Lias Not by M.A. Carrick, and my reread of She Became the Sun. Yeah, I'm sorry, Fourth Wing, that was kind of unfair of me, but still, it's not my favorite subgenre of fantasy, romantasy that is, but I'm fine with it more often than not. But Fourth Wing did it in a way that was extremely annoying to me. It then also had very many glaring errors in my opinion when it came to the world building. It was written in a style that I didn't entirely appreciate. It's written in first person present perspective. I'm not the biggest fan of that either. So basically what happened is approximately 15 things in Fourth Wing came together, and all of them were things that I usually don't like anyway, and so there was exactly one saving grace, and that were the dragons. And I have enough books about dragons that I could be reading or rereading and enjoying a lot more than Fourth Wing, so it wasn't even necessarily doing something special with that. But without further ado, let me get my handy dandy notes out, because I actually did take notes for this, alright? Be proud of me. I'm going to try and go through the sections of what I didn't like about Fourth Wing as succinctly as possible, because I don't want this to be dragged out any more than it already is. So, what did I not like about Fourth Wing, apart from basically everything? We're gonna start with the style of writing, I think, because that is the easiest one out of the way. I very much enjoy books that go into like almost purple prose territory. I'm a big fan. The fancier your words, the better, unless it really doesn't fit for your books and the vibe that you're trying to go for. I love it. Fourth Wing didn't have that whatsoever. It's first-person perspective, and it is written in present tense, which can be a combination that can be sometimes grating, especially because I personally am of the opinion that if you want to write in first-person perspective, you kind of have to give me a reason as to why you're doing that. Is the character telling their story to someone? Is the character writing a diary, or some kind of book, I suppose? And Fourth Wing kind of like tries to give you this excuse, because the very first page that's actually not like the first chapter, says, "The following text has been faithfully transcribed from Navarian into the modern language by Jasinia Nailwort, curator of the Scribe Quadrant at Basquiat's War College. All events are true, and names have been preserved to honor the courage of those fallen. May their souls be commended to Malik." Which is fair, but it also raises the question, who is Violet telling her story to? And why is she telling it so badly? I'm sorry. So, even though Fourth Wing tries to give you a very weird excuse as to why first-person perspective might be something that's interesting to look into, as in, like, you know, as to why the author chose that specific style, it doesn't really expand upon that, at least not in the first book. This is a series, by the way. I do believe there's like 5 books or something planned, which is a lot. I will not be continuing on with the series unless I feel the need to hurt myself, apparently. So obviously this could be something that is explored further along in the books, but like, I had to read 500 pages of first-person present tense perspective with no explanation as to why, and I didn't enjoy that. The writing style is also very juvenile, I feel like. I know that Rebecca Yarros, and I think the people surrounding it as well, were trying to get Fourth Wing to take off as a new adult book instead of like this weird gap between young adult and adult fantasy, because there is a lot of smut in there, and also I do believe that every single character is at least 20, if not older than that. I believe our main character is 20 and the love interest is 22, 23, something along those lines, which is, you know, totally fine. It's whatever. I just don't care about them as people. But anyway, but the writing style felt very juvenile at times, and there were moments that I really didn't appreciate. This is also going slightly into world building territory. For example, where our main character was just mouthing off at people that were her military superiors, and we were supposed to still take her seriously, and I just definitely didn't. So that wasn't exactly great. And the book kind of like continued in that onward, and it was really not my thing, so the writing style couldn't save this book for me. Because I've definitely had books that I found were okay, and the writing style just pulled it out of the mud for me. Fourth Wing didn't do that. Sorry to disappoint, I guess. That's basically all I have to say about the narration. This is probably one of the more subjective parts of this review. Because I personally think that, especially when it comes to style, you just have your taste, and there's really not that much you can do about that. Like, obviously you can read more, and you can read more diversity and see if the book is maybe trying to accomplish something entirely different from what you anticipated, but still, it's fairly hard to just, you know, be like, well, I don't like the style, but yeah, it's nothing you can do. Right, moving on. Let's go with world building. Right, so I read a lot of fantasy. A lot. I started very early when I was really young. One of my first fantasy books that I fell in love with was The Never-Ending Story, and the book was first read to me when I was like 5. So I have been surrounded by fantasy books basically all my life. And I have a very big pet peeve as to how world building is created and subsequently presented. Because not every fantasy book is trying to go for the deepest and most profound world building ever, which is entirely alright, especially if, for example, they have a very different focus. But the problem with Fourth Wing is it was both trying to be very easy to access. As I said, it reads like a very easily accessible fantasy book for those who don't really have a lot of experience with fantasy, but it was also trying to be as deep as possible and completely failed on both accounts, in my opinion. So the first mistake that Fourth Wing made is there is a lot of information that is just presented to you in info dumps. And I'm not even talking about two characters talking to each other and within their slightly stilted and slightly very much set up conversation reveal parts about the world that they obviously know, but we as the reader don't. I'm talking about Violet, the, you know, focal character and also narrator, talking to the reader for pages on end about world-building details none of us asked for, especially not at the moment they were presented. Because we start the book out with the so-called conscription day, where we learn that people are conscribed into the 4 quadrants of the Basgiath War College. First of all 4 are named, 2 of which then never appear again, and without looking into the book, I couldn't tell you what they're called. The only 2 that are somewhat important to the plot and also the main character, Violet, are the Scribe Quadrant and the Dragon Rider Quadrant. The Scribe Quadrant because she was supposed to become a scribe basically all her life, and the Dragon Rider Quadrant because obviously that is the one she inevitably ends up in. To no one's surprise. I mean, we all knew that. That's kind of like what it says on the back as well, so like I'm not surprised that the information was given out on like page 3 or something. But you know, these 2 are the only 2 quadrants that are somewhat important. So what Rebecca Yarros could have done was she could have just, you know, named those 2 very quickly, maybe presented it with a tiny bit of backstory on Violet and said something along the lines of, you know, I was supposed to be a scribe, now I'm not going to be a scribe. Life sucks, I guess. Instead, we get this entire history on not only the 4 quadrants, but also the country that Navarre, which is the country that we're currently in, the country that the Basgiath War College belongs to. We're told about this war that started happening and that is still happening, We needed none of that information. We also needed none of the information on the fact that those are Gryphon riders and we are Dragon riders. We needed none of that. This could have incredibly easily been something that, for example, a war college instructor could have told their pupils while they were at the actual war college. So, way later in the book, actually. We could have had this in kind of like a lecture or something, and even during the lecture we could have then made it clear that, you know, this is not new information for any of the students, but it is required for the teacher to talk about them concerning that, because, you know, this is what they're here for. This is what they're here for, to learn about. We didn't do that. Instead, we just presented the information at a time where no one was even paying attention to the information in the first place. We don't need very detailed world building at the start of a book. We don't. And even if we did, hear me out here, you can just not tell your readers everything in the beginning. Shocker, I know. Some readers are actually willing to stick around just a tiny bit longer to see what's going on. And even, you know, barring that, more often than not, it's just not important to present the information almost immediately. A lot of the information that Fourth Wing basically just kind of like spat at people, with Violet talking to the reader in a very weird way, was completely unnecessary. And I feel like what Rebecca Yarros was trying to do was she was trying to flesh out the world in the easiest way possible, but the easiest way is also the laziest way, and it is also the one that is the most grating. Because she doesn't do that just at the beginning. She doesn't just do it to tell you, like, you know, there's Navarra, and then there's like a few other continents and countries and whatnot. No, she keeps doing it throughout the entirety of the book, to the point where at some point you're also just like, how do you know all this information? Like, I fully understand that, you know, if you are a military nation, it might be kind of interesting to keep up with other countries surrounding you, especially if you have military conflicts with them. But why are you telling it to the reader in this way? Because it makes you seem the authority on information, which is also something that you could technically play with as a writer, I'm sorry, to kind of like go, like, this character seems to have all the information, but actually they're wrong, because they have been brainwashed, they have been indoctrinated, they have just been told wrong information all along, which is also something that Fourth Wing tries to do, and tries to give you as this, like, weird gotcha moment, or like plot twist, which also didn't work. But anyway, but it's the problem with trying to set up a character who's very clearly biased or very clearly brainwashed and then has to unlearn that is you actually have to put work into that. Rebecca Yarros didn't. She just didn't. There's no... It's just information spat out on the page. There was no thought process behind this, except I want my readers to know that I thought about another cool country that we could potentially mention, because we're never going to be there anyway. And it's very aggravating to me personally. I just think there are so many moments where she could have presented parts of that information and kind of like sprinkled it in there, and could have had it relate to important character decisions or important character growth moments, and she didn't. She basically just gave you the information whenever she felt like it, and a lot of the information was not even connected to anything currently happening in the scene. Why? I really didn't appreciate it. And another thing, the thing that did then is, despite explaining to me over and over again what is happening in this world and what's happening in this country and the war college and everything, I remember almost nothing. Because I didn't care. Because it was not connected to any important moments whatsoever, and so the only thing I remember is that at some point there were like 3 pages of our main character calming herself by talking about all the information that she has regarding dragons, which could have been interesting, and I understand that what Rebecca Yarros was trying to go for was, when she wants to calm herself, she just starts reciting textbooks, but it was incredibly aggravating to read, because I was just over there like, can I skim 3 pages now? Do I have to read every single anatomical detail that Violet remembers about dragons? Because I don't want to, quite frankly. What do I do with this now? And It was just bad. It felt very much like trying to cover up how little depth and little thinking went into the world building by just trying to spit out as many fun facts as possible to distract the reader from thinking about it a bit too closely. Which is coincidentally also why I think it's really good for people who are just not that used to fantasy, because it doesn't require any additional thinking. You can just read it, and you're done. Unfortunately, that is exactly what I hate. So, yeah, it was just not done well, in my opinion. And she could have saved it very easily. There were some fixes that even I could think of, and it's just aggravating when you read a book and you're like, I could have fixed this. It just takes out all the joy that you have in reading it, not gonna lie. Right, you know what? I think we're pretty much done with the world building now. Like, I don't want to go into too many specifics, because I do want to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, actually. So, let's just go with characters. Violet was a very, very big not like other girls character. There were some interesting aspects to her character, and also like the overall way that she was described. Like, for example, she did legitimately have a physical disability. I do believe it was supposed to be Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I don't think it was ever named in the book, but it very much reads like that, and I do believe that other people have said so as well, because I think this is own voices in that regard, if I remember correctly. So the whole deal about her being a lot more frail than others, being a lot more prone to injury, etc., relate back to her physical disability. Now, this is something that I find very interesting, because especially in high fantasy, this is not something that is necessarily always discussed. There's very little fantasy that I can think of right now, especially that is a bit more known to people, that is, you know, that shows disability on page, especially not without making it the big character moment TM, as in, you know, the character has to overcome their disability and their problems are going to be solved if there's either a magical cure or they finally accept that, you know, despite their disability, they're still wonderful. And it's very aggravating, even for someone who is not physically disabled. And I know that a lot of disabled readers, especially of fantasy, have been speaking out about this for ages, and they still continue to do so. So in that regard, I think this is a very interesting read to pick up, because it's not about Violet overcoming her disability, it's just Violet who is thrust into a Dragon War college who also just happens to be disabled. That's basically it. To some extent, it's not necessarily like a superpower, that's like the other part of disability rap that people don't necessarily like, which is fair enough. But like, there's a few lines where she's just like, you know, yeah, of course you hurt me during the duel, but like, I'm used to living in pain 24/7, so try something else, bitch. So that was kind of funny. I did enjoy moments like that. But it did still grate on my nerves how she was just constantly described as, you know, this tiny, frail character. She also had to obviously be the only character who had silver white hair. Oh, the cringe. And I think another thing that I also really disliked is, despite the fact that the book doesn't focus on, you know, Violet having to overcome a disability or whatever the hell, what I didn't like about it is that some characters had legitimate concerns, because you have to know this if you haven't read Fourth Wing yet, and honestly if you haven't, I commend you. Under which rock have you been living, and can I scoot in? Basgiath War College is really, really dangerous. Dangerous to the point where even getting there, which requires you walking over a parapet with no safety regards whatsoever, even just getting there kills at least 15% of the, you know, people wanting to get into it on average. Alright? So even just getting into the college itself might kill you. And Violet, like, I think I would have enjoyed this book a lot more if either this had been her intention in the first place, as in if she'd wanted to become a writer anyway, or if we'd address the fact that the reason she was signed up for the college is because her mother wanted her to. She had 6 months, this is something that the book tells you on like the first page, she had 6 months to prepare herself physically and also maybe somewhat mentally to get into this goddamn war college. 6 months. to train. So obviously, she is not as trained as any of the others. And while yes, some of the stuff that's happening in the Riders Quadrant are kind of dependent on luck, I suppose, or how clever you are, but what grated on my nerves is that every so often there were characters, specifically one of them, I'm gonna talk about him in just a second, who was very concerned about her because he was like, you know, you have not been training for this all your life, and I'm afraid that you're gonna die, because this is a very common occurrence in the Riders Quadrant. And she consistently went off on a tangent about how she's so sick and tired of people seeing her as frail just because, you know, for example, of her disability. And I'm over here like, I fully understand that, but also, to a certain degree, all of these people are correct. And you didn't even sign up for this in the first place. I would have enjoyed it so much more if she'd either wanted to do this in the first place, or if she'd been like just a smidgen more angry at her mother for essentially sending her off to potentially die. Very likely die, actually. And not just necessarily because of her disability, or because of how she's built, or because of the fact that she only had 6 months to prepare. I keep repeating that, but it's kind of important. But also because there's a lot of people dying in the Riders Quadrant. And, like, no one seems to really care. In fact, people are so eager to sign up, and I'm just over here like, where are you taking all these people from? Like, how many children does your population bear each year to fix the holes, the gaping holes that becoming part of the Riders Quadrant apparently rips into your population? What's happening there? But anyway, continuing on when it comes to the characters, we obviously had to have a somewhat love triangle. Love angle, really, because the two men don't want anything to do with each other, and the triangle has 3 points that all touch each other. But anyway, so on one hand we have friend, former best friend, now slightly above her in like the military chain. His name is Dane. And he's a douchebag. That's his character trait. We're supposed to hate him because he's a douchebag, and I hate it when it becomes very obvious that an author wants you to very, very specifically hate this one character, because Dane is the character to continuously go like, hey, Violet, I just worry for you so much, and I want you to get out of the Riders Quadrant, I want you to get back into the Scribe Quadrant, please let me help you. And like, he not only wants her to let him help her, but he also very clearly engages in almost illegal activities to try and get her to resign, and he consistently harps on the fact that she is so fragile, which would annoy me as well. But the thing that bothered me about this is that he has so many legitimate concerns, but then they're completely drowned out by the douche-assery that he is consistently spouting all over the place. Also, despite being her oldest friend since childhood, he is also the one who, like, sticks to the rules to the point where every single person is like, what the hell are you doing? That's a whole different thing I'm gonna reserve, like, at least 5 minutes for. This is already getting longer than I wanted it to, but anyway. So that's one part of the love angle. You know, obviously the middle is Violet, duh, and the other one is tall, dark, handsome, brooding bad boy. I just spouted a bunch of words, and every single person who has ever picked up Romantasy, especially from the 2010s, knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'm obviously talking about Xaden. He has shadow magic. He is quite literally a tall, dark, handsome, brooding man with shadow magic. It's... yeah. Obviously he has to be the one who trusts Violet to handle herself, as opposed to Dane, who is mothering to the point of smothering, which is obviously why we're supposed to side with Xaden. I didn't necessarily have a problem with him, except again, the author wanted me to so clearly enjoy him that I just spitefully did the opposite. It was fine. Xaden and Violet also have this absolute extreme will they won't they, which annoyed me to hell and back. I think some people call them enemies to lovers. They're not, because they're not really enemies, even though the book gives you the perfect chance to make them so, because Xaden is the son of the leader of a revolution that happened a few years prior. It also took me a while to figure out that it was just a few years. For some reason it sounded like the revolution had happened ages ago, but apparently it didn't. He was the son of the leader of that revolution, and every single child of, like, important members of the revolution has been marked by the dragons so everyone can see them. They're also not allowed to meet up in private. If more than 3 of them meet up in private, it is counted as sedition, and they can face, you know, criminal offenses, charges, and even execution. Sounds great, doesn't it? And the big issue that I had is that technically Violet has a lot of reasons to dislike Xaden. One, revolution. So she has a almost, you know, societal reason to dislike this man, because the military society that she's part of is very clear on the fact that every single one of them hates the revolutionaries and their children, who are the only people to remain of it, because everyone else was executed. In front of their children, by the way. That's another nightmarish detail this book just casually brushes aside every once in a while, I feel like. And number 2 is, during the revolution, her older brother was killed. This is also something you learn on, like, page 5, again, in, like, a side sentence. It's... Anyway. So she has 2 very good reasons to not like Xaden, and yet almost every single interaction is her just going like, oh, he is kind of hot, though. Like, I would climb him like a tree, and you're just over there like, can you have, like, an ounce of self-respect? No. And yet, for some reason, she's still surprised. Oh my god, wait, do I actually like him? And you're just over like, girl, yeah, yes you do. Why are you the way that you are? It's bad. I'm sorry. It was just incredibly annoying to me. It left, like, the characterization was incredibly wild. And speaking of the whole, you know, she should have reasons to dislike Xaden, and then suddenly she's the only one immune to it, and the first one to go, maybe it is kind of, like, unfair that, you know, the children of the revolutionaries can only meet in groups of 3 or less, because, like, they're just having a nice friendly chat up there. I don't know what's happening, because, of course, she accidentally almost stumbles into one of their meetings, like, I don't know, 70 pages into the book or something. My issue with that is the book could have been so incredibly interesting had we talked about a character who comes from a military society, who has been brainwashed and indoctrinated by that military society into a specific way of thinking, who slowly unlearns that, maybe through characters she meets, maybe through something else. She slowly unlearns that, she slowly starts realizing that she's been, you know, indoctrinated, and she slowly comes to several very heart-wrenching realizations, and that's just not this book. Because this book continuously pretends like the main character has, like, the moral compass, TM, and, like, it's not necessarily preaching to you, but what it's doing is it's making it incredibly easy for the protagonist to basically swap back between whatever she's supposed to be thinking about some people versus what she's actually thinking about them. And the reason this annoyed me so much is because it feels like the book is trying to pretend like it's incredibly easy to do that. And it feels like the book is trying to pretend like it's incredibly easy to not think TM like everyone else without doing the work. And I'm not saying that something along the lines of, you know, having a military book and then having, like, the one character who actually realizes that this is actually kind of bad and maybe shouldn't be done the way that people do it. I'm not saying that this storyline is not also somewhat problematic in some aspects, because, again, it sometimes feels like it's making light of situations like that, and it also sometimes feels like it's placing the individual before societal changes, and it makes it seem like, you know, there's redeemable bad people. I'm not entirely sure how to exactly phrase this. I think what I'm trying to say is it makes it incredibly easy to think of something as a personal issue versus a systemic issue. And Fourth Wing, in my opinion, does exactly that, and it's really, really annoying because there are so many issues with the system. And, like, again, some of these things might be addressed in future books. I'd actually like that if they did that. But in the first book, it felt like Violet had an incredibly easy time thinking for herself, when the entire society seemed very much built upon manipulation of information. This is something that we learn about the Scribe Quadrant, for example. It's a red flag that I've seen coming since page 3, but there's also the whole thing of, like, the military playing such an incredible important role in this society, and our main character seems to be almost the only one who is like immune to that, as well as the children of the revolutionaries who have first-hand witnessed the violence brought upon by the military regime because they've seen their parents get executed. And it just felt like things were going so easy for Violet, and I was not a fan of it. Because the book just flip-flopped back and forth, in my opinion, between trying to be very serious and very dark. As I said, there's a lot of dead people in this book. Like, damn. No holding back, I guess. But there's also so many very flippant moments. Like, for example, the fact, as I said, that Violet just gets to talk super flippantly with people in the military who are way above her in pay grade and influence. And we're supposed to still root for her. And she also never gets punished for that or anything. But we have teachers killing students left, right, and center. Legitimately, teachers killing students. Or teachers looking away when students kill each other. The stakes were not lining up in any way, shape, or form. And the reason this bothered me so much is because I can see the potential of Fourth Wing being either an incredibly gritty and gruesome read that talks about, like, military indoctrination, but it was also trying to be a fun, smutty adventure. The smut wasn't even that good. I probably say this because I could not care less about the two main characters. Or, well, the main character and a love interest, that's how I should phrase that, I'm sorry. Xaden gets one POV chapter at the end of it. So, you know, if you're looking forward to that, there you go. That's your information of the day, I guess. But, like, that was the problem for me, because Fourth Wing was trying to do both, and it was failing at both for me personally, because I was just like, you can't just try and make this funny when it's really not funny. Like, the entire situation is not funny. And I'm not saying that people in military regimes, for example, do not also do things that they would consider to be fun. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that Fourth Wing was just playing, I don't know what tic-tac-toe it felt like with the responsibilities that these characters had to have and with the consequences that they had to experience. And Violet was experiencing basically none of them. And it was incredibly annoying because I saw very different potential for this book, and then it lived up to none of that, and it made me sad. So, yeah, it was just not a good experience, like, in general. I'm gonna put this down now because this is very heavy. Yeah, so, again, did I give this book a fair chance? Honestly, not really. I was already expecting it to not exactly be to my taste, but I thought to myself, I kind of want to experience this for myself and see what's going on. So I definitely went into this with a biased mind, and I also knew that it wasn't necessarily ticking off all the boxes that I personally enjoy when it comes to fantasy reads, but I found this to not be subjectively bad, but also somewhat objectively bad, specifically when it came to the whole, like, military thing. It's not, sorry to say this, but it's not surprising to realize that Rebecca Yarros writes a lot of military romance. Because you can see it. And I'm really not a fan of that, especially when the book, like, more often than not presents itself as this, like, smutty, fast-paced fantasy adventure. And it is that, but it's also glaringly bad when it comes to the representation of military forces, but especially when it comes to the romanticizing of military forces. This is happening with our main character not necessarily thinking anything about her mom practically sending her off to die, the consequences for failing, the fact that basically every single human being seems to be just treated as nothing, really. Like, people don't care that their children could very well die being sent to this war college. And, like, not even in active combat, but in the war college. That's bad. That's really, really bad. And again, a lot of these things might get, you know, talked about later on in the series, but for me, the first book was like it was a mess. And it was a very bad introduction to the whole series, in my opinion. And it's a no from me. I'm I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not really sorry. It's just a no from me, like on all accounts. Yeah, as I said, if you liked this book but you made it this far, please feel free to talk about it in the comments. Feel free to tell me what you yourself enjoyed about the book, or you know, let me know if anything changed, if you changed your mind now, if anything I said changed your mind. Let me know if you are, you know, willing to have a discussion about this. Please keep the comments nice. I would appreciate that. Let me know if this now intrigued you into picking the book up yourself to see what's going on. Yeah, let me know in the comments down below what you think about the book and or this review, and I'm very, very interested to see your thoughts on this. As always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience and you keep on having a nice reading experience, and I will see you soon.